Welcome, as I said, we will be recording this meeting, so just so that everybody is aware of that, and then we'll be making a version available to everybody who's signed up to the webinar afterwards. So thank you, and everybody will get moving, I think, on this. So what's today about? Well, we focus today on the changes to ISO 14001, the latest version, and hopefully you can see my screen with the few slides that we're going to be using today. Really, it's all around what you need to know in terms of 14001 and how you could implement it if you haven't already got it, or if you have already got the previous version of 14001, what it is you need to do to actually consider the changes through to when you transition to the new 2026 version. But one of the things we're going to do, and I'll introduce my colleagues in a moment, is that we are going to talk about how carbon management fits very much within this standard, and that's the one we're going to be focusing on today, but also other standards as well. So I'll do some introductions if I can for a moment. I will actually just remind myself and you of what the rest of what we're going to cover here today. As I said, it's the key changes, but I will introduce Ellie from Climate Essentials in a moment and talk about their role in carbon management. And also then I'm going to introduce Stephen, who's from NQA, and going to talk to you about the benefits of certification and verification, because often people get those two things confused, and Steve will make it very clear what the differences between them. But one of the things we want to do as well is make sure that you understand how you can integrate using data into your management system, and that's one of the key things we want to try and pick up today. But just as an introduction for the three of us here, as I said, I'm Graham. I'm Managing Director of Ley Hill Consultancy Group. Been working in this area for well over 25 years. I'm sure you reckon I don't look that old, but I am, I promise you. I went through one of the early training courses with NQA to actually do the transition to the 2026 14001 lead auditor course. In fact, I think we were the first actual organisation to achieve that with NQA. But also one of the things that really interests me is sustainability, and I've been involved with the ISO committee that's developing the new UN Sustainable Development Goals standard 53001, and that's going to become a very important standard and issued this year. So sustainability and the environment and the much wider focus that that brings. Ellie, I'll let you on if you'd like to just introduce yourself, please.
Absolutely, thanks Graham. Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor Boggis. I'm from Climate Essentials. I'm the Client Success Manager here, so some of you may know me, some of our clients are probably on this call, so hello everyone. I really just look after our clients and make sure that they're having the best time possible on the platform and helping them on their net zero journeys. I previously worked in the carbon credit market, so I've been in sustainability for quite a few years now, helping organisations use to, offset and take responsibility of their emissions in that way. And now I'm more focused on how organisations can reduce their emissions and measure it. So yeah, thanks for having me, and I'll pass over to Stephen.
Thanks, Ellie. Steve?
Thanks, Ellie. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Burt. I'm Carbon and Sustainability Services Director with NQA. NQA are a global certification and verification body. We provide certification and verification to ISO standards, all of the different ISO standards really that you can think of. Like Graham, I have 25 odd years of experience under my belt on all things carbon, energy, sustainability. I am a lead auditor for ISO 14001. I'm a lead verifier, sorry, for the carbon, the greenhouse gas verification standards, ISO 14064-1, and I'm a lead auditor for some sustainability standards as well. So I kind of lead and develop the carbon and sustainability services for NQA, and I also deliver some of them myself. So nice to meet you all.
Thank you both. That's and I think, Steve, you just highlighted there that start to think about the difference between certification and verification, because you sometimes have to think about it as well yourself.
Indeed.
Right, just one thing I'd like everybody, we're going to run this through as a presentation and just talk through for about 30 minutes or so from now on the various aspects that we said we would cover here. But if you've got any questions, put them in the chat for me and we'll try and pick them up between the three of us at the end of the session, if that's okay with everyone. So, different standards, and I'm not going to spend hours on this. Some of you may already have these standards, some may be thinking of getting these standards for one reason or another, and I'm just going to pick out 2 or 3 of them just as a little starting point before we get into the detail of 14,001 and then the other aspects of this webinar today. The key thing about 14,001, it really helps you understand the aspects and impacts that your organisation has on the environment. It's a structured way of thinking through what is it we do and what actual effect are we having, and therefore can we actually improve on that effect and do something better. It allows you to start setting some really clear environmental objectives so that you can actually start to say we are demonstrating that we're improving. And it starts to give you this data structure for monitoring and measurement. You can't demonstrate you're improving unless you're measuring something, and that's going to be critical going forward here. So as we said there's some various bits and pieces here that link directly to carbon management. You're going to get some centralized data, real-time performance tracking, and it very much supports the clauses of planning and performance evaluation. So we'll touch on that in a bit more detail later. Some of you may already have 50,001, the energy management standard. In some ways, it does very similar things. All of these standards are structured in the same way as a management system. So they basically enable you to apply one or more of them in an integrated system if you want to. But in terms of energy, you're very much doing similar things, tracking at performance, looking at how you can reduce your energy usage, and that of course actually then flows through to reducing your carbon emissions. So there's 2 very clear areas there that actually join together, and if you actually look at this, you can start to visualize how you're actually improving through the energy usage and then the carbon that you're producing. So there's a lot of linkages between these different standards. And the last one I'm going to touch on now, because Steve will pick up on it a bit later, is 14064, which is very much around a greenhouse gas accounting standard. I'll leave Steve to talk the difference on verification, but it's not a certifiable standard in the same way as the other 2 are. But Steve will touch on that later. But it's very much gives you a consistent framework for quantifying and reporting on these various standards and emissions that you're making. So that's just the 3 that I wanted to pick up and talk about briefly to you. But what I want to talk about in a little bit of detail, probably for the next 5-10 minutes or so, is just some of the changes to the 2026 version of 14,001. Some of them are very straightforward and simple, as you see there on the slide here. There's a lot of minor changes, cosmetic changes, layout changes. I touched on that the management system standards, the ones ending in 01, tend to all be based around a high-level structure. Some of us have been doing this for years, called Annex SL, because that was how it was originally created. But sometimes the old 14,001 didn't quite align as well with the other standards. So they've done some restructuring of it to make sure that it actually fits slightly better together. Some of the notes that help with implementation have been improved. There's terminology and things in there that people sometimes get tied in knots with, and they've tried to clarify a lot of those things and make them more useful to people when they actually implement this. Result was always something, the word result was always something that was a little bit confusing to people, but it's now very specific. It's going to be used to describe the outcome of a process or an objective. So it is actually, what are you achieving? It's not some of the other things around measurement on the way to it. It's actually the result is, what are you achieving? And one of the things that was always an issue for people was legislation and compliance obligations. And they've turned the word fulfillment now has been strengthened to very much meeting your compliance obligations. And of course, one of the things to think about here is compliance obligations are not just legal obligations. You may have client or customer obligations that you've got to meet within a contract. So it's wider than just meeting your legal requirements. So they're just some of the sort of very quick minor changes that are in the system and within the new standard. But I'm going to go through this, and I apologise for using the clause numbers, but it was just the easiest way to try to structure this for you today. Those of the standards know that the management system standards, clauses 4 to 10, tend to be the ones which tell you what you have to do. And that's what I'm going to focus on now. And clause 4 is very much around your organisation, your business. It's the context in which you work. So it's talking about what is it you do, how do you do it? But what this new standard is saying is you don't just have to think about the environment and the aspects and impacts of which you have on that. It's now saying environmental conditions are very much a focus of what you do. And they've listed 5 conditions that you've really got to consider. This is not an option, really. You have to look at these ones. Climate change has been around for a little while within all of these standards, and it was brought in a few years ago to make it specific to all of the management system standards. But for this particular 14,001 version, they've now added very specifically, you've got to consider pollution levels. Do you create pollution? And that may be something that you're not even really aware of. You know, you think you don't, but if you create waste, you create pollution in some shape or form. What natural resources do you use? Is the overall ecosystem health that you're affecting or working within being compromised in any shape or form, and biodiversity? So those 5 areas now have to be considered within the context of what you do. And it means that you've got to start thinking about all of those things in terms of the operations you do and the services or products that you create. Some of the changes that have been made as well is in terms of the scope of your management system must be documented and available to all your interested parties. Before it was always advised to be documented, but now I think they've been very specific. You've got to have it documented and be very clear what it is that people need to do. It's much harder to exclude anything that may have an impact on the environment. Scope used to be cleverly worded in some cases to avoid some of the dirty operations of an organisation, and I use that in brackets terminology, sort of just to say sometimes people try to say, well, if we only make our scope this, we can exclude the thing that causes the biggest environmental impact. That's not something that's going to be allowed in this new standard. So it may be that some people will have to add to their scope to actually think through what they're going to do in a certain operation in one or more parts of the world, depending on how they operate. And lastly, within the context bit here, there's a very clear thing here that the organisation has to really consider whether it has authority and ability to exercise control and influence over the life cycle of the activities it does or the products it produces. So now we're saying your supply chain, what is it that you actually can demand of your suppliers if you're buying in a product or a part that then has to at some point be recycled or get reused at the end of its life. So that life cycle aspect is a key part of it now. You can't just focus on the bit you do. You've got to look at it in a much wider sense across the whole of the product or service that you deliver. In clause 5, leadership, now there's very much more emphasis on leaders being expected to lead. There's really sort of a cultural change required here. It used to be that leaders had to just provide the resources to deliver the management system. But now it's all relevant roles. So if you have somebody doing something in a particular factory or a particular operation, you've got to support them as a leader and make sure they've got the resources and things to do the job. We don't want them to be just left on their own, because now the leaders are expected to show that commitment that they are trying to really focus on the environment and demonstrate it through the appropriate roles and responsibilities of people elsewhere in their organisation. Responsibility, accountability, we can talk all day about the difference between those and where they all fit, but it's very much being now make it very clear about who's accountable, who's responsible, and making sure that leaders are taking their level of responsibility and accountability depending on where they sit in the organisation. I've already talked a little bit about supply chain, but what's called in the standard externally provided processes, products or services is really what we're talking about here. The outsourcing that you do, the things that you buy in to use, the services you buy in to use. But if you have any control or influence over those, they will be part of your management system going forward. You couldn't say, oh, well, it's out of scope because that's something a supplier does. Now, if you can influence that, you have to include that within your management system. The policy statements that used to be written were fairly standard and everything else, but the commitment is not just to protect the environment, but actually now needs to actually say, what is it we do and how that you're going to actually deal with specific areas within your context. So if you go back to that first clause 4 about those different conditions, if you have a particular issue with biodiversity in you would expect to see that in your policy statement, not just we make a commitment to protect the environment, which is what has been happening in the past. Clause 6, planning, is probably the one area that's got the most changes. And that's relevant, I think, to the idea that organisations really need to think about this rather than just ticking boxes, which has happened in the past. There's a lot more on risk and opportunity in this standard. So it's really making sure that people can actually focus on what are the risks of the things we are doing to the environment and what are the opportunities. And if you've got a risk register, you will have to now explicitly focus on the environmental aspects and impacts, not just have a risk register over here that is different to your aspects and impacts over here. And the two must come together in this life cycle perspective. So you really need to think about all of the products and services and how they affect the environment. There's a whole new clause about properly planning changes. So if you, for instance, decide to put up a new building on your site, if you haven't actually, and you've got ISO 14001, you could get a major non-conformity if you haven't considered the environmental impacts, etc., of putting up that new building on your site or the operations you do within that building. So there's a whole new thing there, and all of this now has to be in a documented process. So whereas clause 6 planning was you could describe it of how you went through the planning aspects of your environmental management system, you now need a documented process to be able to show that. Clause 7, there's not a lot of change here. This was the support clause. there is that thing about the emphasis on life cycle, and that might mean you need some more information from suppliers, and considering how reliable that information is. So the communication parts of this is got to be demonstrated now to be consistent and reliable. So if you're getting information and it's a two-way thing from your suppliers and they're telling you about certain emissions, certain carbon information, how reliable is that information you're getting from them, and vice versa if you're passing it back to them. And data's the important thing here, because even your own people, the competence of your own people, who will affect the way your management system actually operates, are you giving them the right information? So have you got the right, reliable, consistent data to give back to your people or to anyone else in the interested parties who asked for it? Clause 8, again, not a lot of change here. The big changes were in context and planning. I'll say that now. That's where the big changes were within this new version of 14,001. But it's clear now that because of the life cycle aspects, you've very clearly got to take account of the normal conditions, abnormal or emergency situations of your operations. And they've sort of reworded emergency preparedness slightly to make it more focused on actual emergency situations rather than a lot of the hypothetical side of what you were doing in the past. They said they used to use the word foreseeable emergency situations. Now it's potential. So it's been making it more focused on those things that actually could happen. And lastly, and you'll be pleased to know I'm going to hand over in a moment and I'll stop talking, but in performance evaluation improvement, the clauses 9 and 10, a few minor little changes here. Audits must have a very defined objective. We always used to say when we did an audit, they had to have a scope and what is it you're going to do. But now, what's the objective of doing the audit? You've got a bit more now to say, why are you doing an audit? What are you going to get out of it? And they should have much more focus on the environmental objectives and achievements that you're actually trying to do. So it's actually looking to see whether you can actually do these things. And lastly, they've made some structural changes within management review, but I'm not going to go into any of the detail here. But in management review, data and documentation is going to be vitally important to be able to demonstrate exactly how you're performing and what you're doing. And that requirement for data and documentation really leads me nicely into Ellie, who's going to talk a little bit about climate essentials. You're on mute, Ellie, at the moment.
Cool,
yeah, you're
perfect.
there.
Thanks, Graham. I'm here. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about Climate Essentials. So Climate Essentials is effectively a platform where you can manage your carbon, so you can measure your full Scope 1, your Scope 2, and your Scope 3 emissions. It's split into measure, track, and reduce. So if you just flip onto my slides for me, please, Graham. Sorry, I don't have control, so I'm going to be asking you to flip across. So yeah, and so yeah, there you go. So yeah, we're award-winning carbon accounting platform to help our clients measure, manage, and reduce their carbon emissions in a clear and practical way. And if you just go to the next slide, please. So we're not going to do a demo today because that would probably take up too much time. But if anyone's interested, happy to take that off on another call. But our platform is mostly split into this 4 sections. So you've got your first section, which is your measure, your track, your reduce, and the report. So next slide, please. So how we've split it out is into 4 sections. So you don't need to worry about what goes into which scope. You're just going to look at your energy, your transport, your products and services, which is all of your Scope 3, which Graham spoke about. And I'm going to speak a bit about that later with regards to supply chain and waste. And step 2.
Next slide.
Next slide, please.
Sorry. Yeah.
Is all about tracking your organisation's emissions over time. So as Graham pointed out, you know, for your ISO, it's very important that this is a yearly exercise. So your dashboard's going to be able for you to quickly access your data. So whether that's looking at this year's, last year's, or you can go all the way back to 2019. You're going to be able to see, you know, your footprint as a whole, but also broken down into the different scopes. On this platform as well, you're going to be able to pull 2 reports, which will be very useful in your ISO submissions. You're going to have a summary report and then a much longer report, which breaks your emissions down into all those different scopes of emissions. So that's a really important aspect of the platform. And then thirdly, we have reduce. So built into the platform, we have provided you with lots of different reduction strategies across the 4 different areas, and that's energy, transport, products and services, and waste. So we give you opportunities or ideas of where you can reduce those, and you can actually map those reductions. So, for example, if you have a net zero target for 2050, you can map those reductions to see, you know, how you're going to get to net zero as a business over time. So, you know, some of these you might want to implement today. Smart meter, for example, very easy to implement. However, you know, changing all your windows to be more efficient, or, you know, electrifying your fleet may not happen tomorrow, but you can kind of plan for those things to happen in years to come, and that will help you really map out that net zero journey in the platform as well. And then the final step is reporting, which I mentioned already. So you can kind of see that map net zero there. Obviously, the reductions haven't actually been made in that graph. I need to update that, but you'll see that blue line is the net zero target. And the idea is once you've kind of mapped all of your reductions, that will meet those reductions will meet that 90% reduction. And next slide, please, Graham. So we won't go into, I won't spend ages talking, but I thought I would just pick out kind of the main points of how Climate Essentials supports your ISO 14001 in particular. So obviously it supports the plan, do, check and act cycle through structured carbon measurement and reduction planning. So instead of maybe working in that very complicated, messy spreadsheet that you may have been doing all of your calculations to before, using the Climate Essentials platform really helps you more easily be able to track your emissions. You know that they're going to be aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol. We can help you identify, you know, the correct emissions factors to use for that particular thing that you're trying to measure. So there's no guesswork. You can always rely on us for that support. It helps you organisations identify the key emission sources within their scopes 1, scope 2, scope 3, and also highlight, you know, where majority of your emissions might be coming from. So it really helps you target where that reduction can be made. A clear carbon baseline. So as many of you know, for net zero, and you're going to need to set a baseline. So that's, you know, the start of your carbon measurement, and all your reductions are going to be measured against that baseline, so that through the platform you can create that baseline. It helps you evidence your progress against the environmental commitments, so you'll get those reports every year. Tracking emissions, it's kind of a repeat. You've got the dashboard and the reports, so you can easily provide those to the likes of Graham and do your auditing, so that it's all in one place and easy to digest. And then also, finally, we do support, you're looking at your scope 3 in particular, looking at that supply chain collation. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Graham. I've kind of highlighted our 4 main services. And so you've got the Climate Essentials for Business, which is the self-guided platform. You can measure your footprint yourself. It's all aligned to the greenhouse gas protocol. And we've got footprint verification, which is where we verify the data that you've put in and make sure you're not missing anything. We look at your kind of accounts and make sure that nothing's missing and that it's all aligned to the greenhouse gas protocol and its methodologies. And then we have the managed service, which is basically when, you know, if you don't have the time or maybe it's your first time measuring, we would, you know, guide you through that process. So through the data collection, putting in good practice for data collection for the years to come, where you might want to do this on your own. We would populate the platform and produce you with a verified footprint report. And then finally, we do have the climate essentials for supply chain, which is really key here because this can really help you improve your scope 3 reporting and supplier engagement. So instead of relying on industry average data, so when you kind of measure your scope 3 footprint, usually you're relying on that industry average data. So you're not actually asking your suppliers necessarily what their emissions are. You're using averages, which more often than not will overestimate what your actual footprint is. So if you're going to really look into decarbonisation and reducing your footprint, one of the ways to do that is to start speaking to your suppliers, and that is where Climate Essentials can really help you do that. We have a special version of the platform where you can invite your suppliers to upload their actual data to the platform. So instead of relying on industry average data, you're getting that primary data from your suppliers, which will reduce your footprint overall. Obviously, you know, depending on how many suppliers you have, you might not want to invite them all to the platform. So what we can do is we can kind of do an estimation of all of your suppliers' emissions, and then you can maybe pick, you know, the top 50, top 10, top 15, whatever you choose to, you know, then reach out to and say, hey, you know, we'd love to either have you already started measuring your footprint, please send us the report, we'll upload it for you. Or if they haven't started measuring yet, this is a great, you know, place where they can start measuring using our platform. You can invite them with a link. So really, yeah, links to the new updates to the ISO 14001 with that scope 3 engagement. And then I think that is the final slide. Oh, and then obviously we've just got some client testimonials. And then on the next slide as well, these are just some of our clients that we work with, just to name a few. So yeah, I'll hand over, I think it's to Stephen now.
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. I think the data side of it is really important now. Now, Steve, I'm sure you'll pick that up in a second as well, about now having the right data rather than maybe the average data that has been used a lot in the past. But Steve, that's what we've already said what you're going to talk about. But I think perhaps why is UCAS certification so important as well is definitely one I'd like you to pick up on if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned previously, NQA are a global certification body, but we're also a verification body. And there's a distinct difference between the two. From our point of view, it means that our regulator, which is UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service, which is the UK's national accreditation body, they accredit NQA to be able to provide certification services and verification services against the various ISO standards. So the reason that we seek accreditation from UCAS to be able to perform the work that we do, it's all about credibility. It's all about ensuring the process of certification and verification is as robust as it possibly can be. So it means that we, as NQA, have to work to some other ISO standards, and UCAS come and audit us against those ISO standards. They come in regularly throughout the course of each year, and they perform audits of the processes that we have in place, including, for example, competency processes and how we perform even quotation processes. So there's standards which control that. So UCAS accredit NQA to be a certification body, and UCAS accredit NQA to be a verification body. It's very important actually that if you're choosing to demonstrate to your customers, your supply chain, your stakeholders that you have a good environmental management system in place, for example, or you have a good energy management system in place, choosing a UCAS accredited body to undertake that certification piece is very important for credibility purposes, but also in your supply chain. If there's informed procurement decision makers in that supply chain, they will know to look for a UCAS accredited certificate that you provide to them. So it kind of saves a bit of, it's a bit of a safeguard there as well in making sure that you do it that way. And obviously, because we have to work to certain standards ourselves, it ensures the service is as high quality as it possibly can be. So let's talk about certification first. So when we are accredited by UCAS to provide certification services, this is for management system standards. And Graham mentioned those generally are the ones that end in 01, but not always. So we provide certification services to certify that the management system is in place, it's being maintained, and it's subject to continual improvement. So we do certification, for example, ISO 14001 we're discussing today, environmental management systems. ISO 50001 is the energy management system. ISO 21221 is the event sustainability management system standard. That's kind of growing in recognition, growing importance. ISO 53001, Graham mentioned earlier, this is the pending United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Management System standard. Very, very excited about that coming along. And then there's some others as well. PAS 2080 is a carbon management and buildings and infrastructure standard. So when we undertake certification services, it's to certify, and it results in a certificate which lasts for 3 years, that the management system is in place, it's implemented, it's subject to improvement. So I've kind of mapped out the steps there. We'll always try at the beginning of the process to understand what your needs are and whether there's any training requirements. That we have NQA training, offer various accredited training courses as well. We usually come to site to perform, if it's your first time being certified to ISO 14001, for example, we'll conduct a stage 1 assessment. A stage 1 assessment is a kind of short duration audit. It is really about, making sure that the arrangements that you have in place are in conformance with the requirements of the ISO standard, but also able to control the environmental aspects and impacts, for example, the compliance obligations that your particular organisation are going to be subject to. So the output from the stage 1 audit is an audit report. Usually, not always, but usually there are some findings in there. We raise those as what's called areas of concern, and that gives you an opportunity to close those out ahead of the stage 2 assessment. So the stage 2 assessment is when we make a decision about whether to award certification or not. So the stage 2 assessment is typically a longer duration audit, and we're testing the implementation of the management system at that stage 2 assessment. So we'll do process-based audits, really. We'll follow the process through, what comes in into your warehouse, for example, and then what goes out the door is finished product. And we'll follow that process through and hook onto audit trails that relate to the particular ISO standard itself. And then hopefully, all being well, at the end of the stage 2 assessment, we can make an award of certification. And when the certificate is issued, for example, for ISO 14001, it lasts for 3 years. So we go through an annual cycle. We call it a surveillance visit in year 1, and then a surveillance visit in year 2. And then in the 3rd year, before the certificate expires, we'll perform what's called a recertification assessment, which is a slightly bigger audit. It allows us to make sure that we've covered everything we need to cover over the 3-year period. Any findings that have been raised over that 3-year period have been addressed and prevented from recurring as well. And the output from that is a reissued certificate for another 3 years. So that gives you an idea of what the process looks like from our point of view. We are accredited by UCAS against a standard called ISO 17021. That probably doesn't mean much to it, and you probably don't need to think about it very hard, but that's my life, making sure that our processes comply with ISO 17021. But that's what makes our management system certification services such high quality, that we have to follow the UCAS rules on that. Okay, Graham, thanks. Next slide, please. So this is a slightly different service. This is NQA operating as a verification body rather than a certification body. And UCAS, again, they accredit us as a verification body. The standard which they accredit us to in this case is, there's actually two. There's one called ISO 14065 and one called ISO 17029. So again, those standards lay out how our service must be developed, how we must deliver it, the competency requirements of the verifiers delivering the service, undertaking the verifications, and so on. That allows us to operate as an accredited verification body. The difference with verification is, if you think about when we talked about certification for a management system, we certify the management system, we certify that it's implemented, we certify that it's being maintained and being improved, and we certify it for a 3-year period at a time. So very often, you know, kind of looking at current timelines and future timelines. Verification is actually looking back in time. It's a retrospective look. So for verification, it's numbers that we verify, greenhouse gas numbers that we're verifying here. And we're always looking back at a historical data set. So for example, the previous calendar year, or for example, the previous fiscal year. And we'll look at your greenhouse gas data for that period, and we'll verify that it's correct, essentially. We can undertake the verification for greenhouse gas standards to 2 different levels. So there's a limited level of assurance, and then there's a reasonable level of assurance. And a limited level is the sampling that we do is less deep, and reasonable level, the sampling that we do is much, much deeper. And those are terms that are taken from financial accounting standards. So we use the same for carbon accounting standards. But specifically, the standards that we're accredited to work with to deliver services are ISO 14064-1. So that's the international ISO standard for greenhouse gas quantification and reporting. Many companies voluntarily seek verification to other companies for legal reasons, for regulatory reasons, must be verified against ISO 14064-1. There is another standard, ISO 14068-1. This is the transition to net zero standard. It uses carbon neutrality as a mechanism to achieve net zero. It's based on ISO 14064. It uses the same quantification, greenhouse gas quantification methodologies. And much as Ellie had the nice graph of the science-based target working towards the ultimate net zero target, this is exactly what ISO 14068-1 involves as well. So we offer verification to that. And super exciting, hasn't happened yet. It was supposed to have happened previously. I think it's probably going to be Q1 2027 now. But then we'll see ISO launch ISO 14060. So this will be the world's first international ISO standard for net zero aligned organizations. So again, if supply chain needs you to demonstrate that you're on track, you're aligned to your net zero targets, that will become, I think, this is my personal opinion, but I think that will become a kind of go-to for procurement departments and supply chains, in the same way that ISO 14001 has become a go-to as well. So keep an eye open for that coming. And interestingly, the 14060 net zero standard is based again on the 14064 greenhouse gas quantification standard. So one leads to the other, which is great. So the process which we follow for a verification, we do what's called a pre-verification. It tends to be a very short duration visit, sometimes half a day, sometimes just 1 day, just to make sure, again, that there's no big gaps in your data, make sure there's no big gaps in your documentation. It allows us to run some risk assessments on your data and allows us to prepare a sampling plan. And then we use that sampling plan for the main verification, which is a longer duration verification. We sample your data, we track it all the way back to the original data source, whether it's scope 1, 2, or 3, all the way back to the original data source, and look for evidence that you have handled that correctly, generated it correctly, converted it correctly, and reported it correctly in your greenhouse gas report. So the verification is very much a deep dive into your quantification processes itself. And then the final stage in the verification is what we call the post-verification. So this is a mandatory regulatory requirement for us as a verification body. We must have this stage. It's called an independent review in the standard, but we call it a post-verification. So this is when one of my colleagues who hasn't been involved in the verification, who is also a lead greenhouse gas verifier, rubber stamps the issue of what's called the verification opinion statement. So we don't produce a certificate like we do for management systems. We produce a verification opinion statement, which, as I say, is for a historical retrospective period of time, to verify that that period of time, your greenhouse gas quantification reporting has been done in conformance with the ISO standard. So hopefully that's given you a nice overview of the services we provide and some of the differences between certification, verification, and a little bit about the value of UCAS accreditation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And just to finish off, just sort of thinking, I think we probably covered it in these different sessions here, but I think the benefits here is really about getting yourself ready for compliance readiness. It's actually being prepared to be able to do that properly. Make better decisions because you've got better data, and ultimately save some costs, because if it's energy or resource efficiency, will all help you with those things. Help you with advanced scope 3 reporting and credibility on your reporting. And that gives confidence not only within your organisation, but to your customers as well. And I think one of the big things here that's come out of this session here is the linkages to data. It's absolutely clear that having the right data and being able to verify it is so important for any of these topics that we've been talking about. We can see how the Climate Essentials system can really complement the ISO different frameworks, but it really gives that data-driven environmental background to what you're trying to do. Obviously supports the compliance, the reporting side, but more importantly, I think Steve touched on it as well, it's about continuous improvement. All the management system standards, all of these things are about trying to improve what you do. Now, whether that's energy management or primarily, as we're talking about here, environmental management and carbon reduction, but it's actually important that you've got the right data to be able to do those things. And it puts you in that position ready for future climate requirements that come along. And Steve's talking about some of those future standards that he and I have been involved in different ways. So it's so important to have all of this in the right way. And I think that's where we are at the end of our little presentation today. If you've got any questions you want answered now, put them in the chat for us. I can't see anything in there at the moment, but no. If you haven't got any particular questions, you can either get us on, you can come through to myself on the info@leyhill.com account there, or as I said, everybody who's signed up to the webinar will be getting a copy of the actual recording and things later, so you'll be able to digest some of it, and if you need to come back to us, you can at any point in time. So I can't see anything in the chat, so I'm going to say thank you very much, give you 9 minutes of your time back, which I know everybody always appreciates. I'm going to thank Ellie and Steve for contributing today. So thank you very much for that. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks, Graham.